Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Yarby Laws, and this is my co-host.
Just for Walls.
We appreciate all the support and the recent content. We do have a comment to read from Corinna Massey, 9595, on YouTube, and it was about our short on the Bucks. And he said, or she said, I'm not sure which one you are, but as a Bucks fan, I'm not allowed to agree with this vid, but this is maybe slightly true. And yeah, I mean, I understand that completely because I remember, when we first talked about the Bucks in their offseason, we both weren't too high on it. We kind of thought it was mid, and then we kind of got attacked about it a little bit. Some people thought that was a bad take, whatever the case may be. But they have had a horrible start, and it's not the fault of Giannis and Dame. It's really been the other guys, the rotation, and definitely the coaching, which I don't even think we really touched on last episode.
Yeah, I mean that's the tough part is that, like you said, you're in the season and it's very clear that Lillard and Giannis are playing really well, both of them. Because Lillard struggled at times last season, but this season, other than maybe one game or so, he's been awesome. But it hasn't mattered. They've just still gotten lit up. And then like you said, in addition, the second unit guys have been just atrocious. I mean, like that's the other. I mean, they've already shaken up their rotation already, which we'll probably get into as we get into the episode. But it's still quote unquote early in the season, but you can't keep having the stretch because otherwise you're gonna fall into a hole really quickly, and it may be tough to get out of. Even though at this point in the East, most teams' records aren't really that good, other than Boston and Cleveland.
Yeah, agreed 100%. And before we do get started, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Yeah, so we're basically through another week of basketball, and this week you had a matchup that I think kind of went under the radar in some ways, but not really, and that was the Warriors and the Celtics. Now, to be fair, the Celtics didn't have Jaylen Brown. They also obviously have been without Porzingis for a little while, right? He hasn't played at all. But, this was still kind of a anticipated matchup because of the fact that, Boston obviously is at home. They're the defending champs. Obviously, they, played the Warriors in the finals a couple years ago and they lost to Golden State. But Golden State has been on a tear. They won, 118, 112. And, pretty much every game, if you've watched them, I mean, on both ends of the floor, they've just been like ridiculously good. Even in the games when Steph was out, they have not had really any issues. Because there was the first game that Steph was out against New Orleans. They started off pretty bad against New Orleans, where they were down by a lot, and then they quickly turned the tide. And then since then, they've just been ridiculous. And even before that, they were playing well. But you look at Steph. He had a typical Steph game, right? 27 points, 9 assists, 7 rebounds, 4 steals, and a block. Basically the best player out there, outside of Tatum, who played very well too, especially as the game went on, right? But then you look around at the rest of the group, like Andrew Wiggins at 16-2, Draymond had 9-6. I mean, you look around, Gary Payton, had 2 blocks and a steal and a bunch of major defensive plays in the fourth quarter. Buddy Hield with 16 off the bench. Kevon Looney now playing pretty well as a backup big. They're young. The funny thing is that the younger guys, by and large, have not really been that great. I mean, like, they've been okay in some spots, but like as a whole, they really have been kind of mediocre, right? Like, I mean, I don't think Pods played in this game because he was sick, but he's not really been good this season so far. He shot the ball very poorly. Kaminga's been kind of up and down, but mostly down, I think, for the most part, other than like in some moments, just not shooting the ball well at all, but he's still, doing things at different points. But they just have so many guys out there on both ends of the floor that can give you something. And obviously, like, to be fair, Boston did have some key guys out. So if we're talking about like a quote unquote potential finals matchup, I think it would look different. But the Warriors have stood out so far this season, I think, because of the fact that everybody was so low on them, including seemingly like the star, right, of the team, Steph. But so far, they've been able to just kind of be great on both ends of the floor. I mean, I want to say they're top 3 on offense and defense. And,
Yes.
getting off to a start like this early in the season is really important, especially when you see, a lot of other teams in the Western Conference are starting to pick up now, but they had to catch up, whereas Golden State's just been ahead of the curve the entire time.
Yeah. This could be the kind of start of a playoff berth for them. I think this is kind of like the ideal way that you want to start the season, like you talked about. Steph's been playing pretty freaking good, but I think the star of the show is Buddy Hield. Like the stuff that the guy brings to the table, each night offensively, and I would even say defensively. I think he's grown quite a lot.
Yeah.
Regular season wise. From last year, where, you see a lot of effort. He's out there trapping, being out there, being aggressive, tipping the ball, and that's kind of something that I think he's kind of always lacked, and definitely not known to be a defender. So it's kind of cool to see him leaning into 3 and D. And then everybody else kind of following suit as well. Like you talked about Wiggins having a much better start to the season than last year. Moses Moody putting in quality minutes, and they're so deep, like you talked about. And when they first announced 13-man rotation, I kind of laughed and scoffed at it. I was like, what is this last ditch effort to try and get back into the play-in or something? But my God, it's really worked out in their favor for sure. And it's team basketball, super duper oriented. And I know we'll probably touch on it in the rumors, but I know the talk of the town is they're probably going to flip a lot of these guys to potentially get a star, down the line. Because I think this isn't a championship roster. I think it's a good regular season team, but I feel like you need that solid, bona fide, consistent number 2 star next to Steph if you kind of want to be in the title conversation, if you're the Warriors.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's kind of how you have to approach it. And it's funny because last season they actually started off the year pretty well. Then they just had a really rough stretch for a little
Sure.
while, and it took them a long time to they were playing well, but they were still like around that 8 to 10 spot for most of the rest of the season, even though they were winning a lot of games because everybody else was winning ahead of them as well. And that's kind of the thing that we talked about where, one bad stretch of in the during the season can hurt you. It can kind of end your season essentially, right? So like for Golden State, if you want to make any type of meaningful run, you've got to avoid the play-in just because of the fact that you have to work so much harder to get out of the play-in, and then you go against a really good team in the first round, and you just have to have certain things go your way. It's just a lot better to be towards the top, right? We're gonna have to still see if they can keep this up, just because of the fact that it's still 8 games in, and anything can happen, right? Guys got to be healthy. Guys have to continue playing well. But like you said, this is the start that you're hoping for if you're Golden State, right? Essentially,
Yes.
get off to a really good start, try to win as many games as you can, and then, like you said, flip some of these pieces that are either not playing well or maybe aren't necessarily part of the future core of your roster for a guy that could be at the deadline that may possibly be better than the guys that they we're chasing after in the summer. We don't know because we don't know what's going to open up. But that's, I think, what you're hoping for if you're Golden State. So, so far, everybody on that roster, essentially aside from a couple guys, pretty much have understood the mission. And even then, they've been able to withstand some guys being a little bit more up and down because they just have so much depth. Right.
Yeah.
And that is something that we're kind of learning is in the regular season, you do need depth because, even the Boston Celtics, right, with, 2 of their 3 best players out, they were consistently in this game because you still had a bunch of other guys who could kind of come in and, give them big minutes. Like Neemias Queta, right? Just comes in and has 14 and 8, and he's typically like a backup 3rd string center, right? Peyton Pritchard continues to play well off the bench, right? So that's the thing is that, like you said, I don't necessarily feel like this Warriors team is a championship team, but for a regular season team, it looks like as of right now, it's better than last year's team. And I think the youth also helps for sure. Because, when you have some of the older guys on the roster from last year, it just, makes things easier. And then even for like a Looney, now you have a little bit more consistent offensive options. So now he can kind of play his role better versus like last year. It just felt kind of forced for him where he just looked like he might have just been kind of done. But, just pretty much shout out to everybody on the roster and the front office because I think they did a much better job than we thought, but they still have to keep it going and we'll just have to see.
Yeah. Agreed 100%.
Yeah. So, continuing to kind of go, with the theme of, some of these other, teams around the league, we do have some teams that were able to kind of, climb back in after a really tough start, like say the Denver Nuggets, right? After, starting the year off below 500, they've won 3 in a row to go back to 5-3, and this is without Jamal Murray, who had a concussion, and since the last time we had recorded, also without Aaron Gordon, who's going to be out unfortunately for multiple weeks with a calf injury, if I'm not mistaken. And it's been kind of interesting to see this Denver team have to adjust on the fly, right? Because outside of Murray, right, they've been generally speaking pretty healthy for the last 2 seasons, right? Obviously, they had the stretch right after the first conference finals appearance where Murray had the ACL tear, Porter had the back issues, but they were still getting contributions. But you look around now, and Russell Westbrook's been inserted into the starting lineup, and he's been playing significantly better basketball than he was playing. And I did kind of mention that he has a reputation for starting the seasons off slow, and he's been picking it up as of late. You got a great game from Christian Braun. This was against OKC, by the way, right, who at this point was undefeated. Jokic continues to play awesome, right? He had 23, 20, and 16 in 40 minutes. Yeah, Peyton Watson gets the starting nod with Aaron Gordon out, 3 blocks, a steal. Michael Porter Jr. with 24. Like, this is the type of stuff that you want to see if you're the Nuggets. Now, the bench is stretched even thinner, so that's a major problem because that means that you're going to have to play some of these guys. I mean, Porter was playing 41 minutes, Watson at 34, Jokic at 40, Westbrook at 32, Christian Braun at 36. I mean, basically, Strother, Hunter Tyson got 18 minutes, and Zeke Naji. So their second unit is stretched really thin now without Gordon. And Murray will be back, I'm assuming, relatively soon, right? Because, he's not going to miss too much time with the concussion protocol. But it's good to see Denver, playing better. And this was a great win against a really good team, right? Because it's not like this was just, like a win against a scrub team. This was against the top team in the West that blew them off the floor when both teams were, the Thunder were missing Hartenstein. But in the case of the Nuggets were fully healthy at that point. So, the 3-point shooting was much better in this game. And that's something that's a little bit different, right? Because instead of Gordon, right, it's Watson, who hadn't shot the 3-ball well either. But it's a different look. And for a guy like Watson, this is a important big moment for him because of the fact that, this is going to be his best opportunity to get a lot of experience and playing time because who is going to, come in after him, right? So this is kind of the moment where now he gets to play with the starters as opposed to mostly with the second unit. And so this could hopefully be a path to build some confidence, get some reps in, so that way by the time the season continues to go on and he's back in the second unit, he might be better, in addition to some of these other guys. But I don't know. But either way, like, it's good to see them crawl back up to above 500 now. Hopefully they can keep it up because it's going to be tough because they're obviously without one of their most important players.
Yeah, I love the confidence that I saw from Russ, not hesitating on the threes, pulling it, with the confidence. And, confidence matters when you're shooting these kinds of shots. He's doing it all. And these are the kinds of games that I think the Denver Nuggets are going to have if they want to, potentially stand a chance and kind of climb back in, fully like you were talking about. Because we've already talked about it. The Jokic 40-point games are just not going to get you a whole lot of wins. That's just, you're going to either barely graze past some interesting squads or you're going to lose. So to kind of see him have that all around MVP level game alongside some other capable scorers in this game was pretty amazing to see. And like you said, I think the biggest thing is they did this shorthanded, which is interesting. I think it raises some questions potentially, about the longevity of things, but regardless, shout out to them for stunning Oklahoma City. I didn't think they were going to come in there and win that game because Oklahoma City had been looking pretty unbeatable as well, and I think they did a great job offensively and defensively against this young OKC squad.
Yeah, with that loss from OKC, now the only team that's left undefeated is Cleveland, who's 9-0, right? Obviously, we've talked about them already, so we don't necessarily have to address that again and how well they're playing. But, you kind of look around at some of these other teams and, like a couple of teams. And again, like the records as of right now, it's such a small sample size. So these can all change at the drop of a hat. Like if you look at the Eastern Conference, only 2 teams are above 500. Everyone else is 500 and below, right? The Pacers, right, who were way towards the bottom about a week ago. Now they're third in the Eastern Conference, but they're 4-4, right? Right with the Brooklyn Nets. And, that's a little bit different. With Halliburton, reportedly, it seems like he's had a back issue. So that, kind of tracks in terms of why he's been struggling in terms of his play. Well, so that, that I think that's a fair assessment where, yeah, if you're going to have a back issue, that explains it. And he has been playing better the last few games. So that's definitely helpful because they need him to play better in order to win, obviously, right? Because that's their best player. And, they do have a lot of depth. You got a much better performance from Jarius Walker, right, who's now getting more minutes because they have some guys out due to injury, right? Because now they're down both centers, right? So that's the guy that I'm talking about that's probably going to have to play a lot more front court minutes now because guys are out. Also, I think Neesmith also got hurt too. So, they're basically down a starter and then two of their backup bigs. So that's the nice part about having a lot of depth like we talked about before.
Yeah, for sure. I think it kind of raises some questions about Indiana as a whole. Do they look to kind of maybe be sellers during the deadline because of the amount of talent that they do have? And I feel like there's some guys on the team that probably don't need to be there anymore. But at the end of the day, like you talked about, the depth is kind of interesting considering the injuries that they do have. And it wouldn't surprise me if they do kind of reach out and try and grab, a full-time center or something like that at the deadline, because I think they have what it takes to create some sort of package and find a guy that could easily, slot in for, the guys that are hurt. But I have been feeling a little bit better on Indiana as a whole. Maybe not so much Halliburton. Halliburton's still kind of scaring me a little bit, but the Pacers as a whole, I felt a little bit better about. But the Eastern Conference right now, my stock is very low on them because, like you said, there's only two teams that are above 500 at the moment. Two very good
Yeah.
teams, but the rest are kind of
Right.
just filling in, and it's a hot mess.
Yeah, and then with the Magic, I mean, they've just fallen off because of Paolo's injury, and that's
Sure.
the main thing that sucks. And it's rough because you do have some guys that are playing well this season, like Jalen Suggs is playing well, right? I mean,
Awesome.
Anthony Black off the bench, has been, really good for them. But it's just tough to put all these missing pieces together when, your best player is out. Wendell Carter Jr. I think's been out for a few games as well. So, the Paolo part where it's just that's your main source of offense. Obviously, they have other good players as well. It's just that's your superstar that you need to kind of carry you through these games, and it's just been really tough for them overall. So I think at this point for the Magic, probably until Paolo comes back, they're probably going to really continue to struggle, which is not really a hot take, and that's what we expected anyways. It sucks because the injuries are starting to pile up as we get into them.
Yeah, for sure. Orlando was kind of one of those teams that was, we they were on our radar for sure as to kind of be one of those next young, hungry, up and coming teams, especially considering the top end talent on that roster. But unfortunately, Paolo being out, does put a huge, limiter on what this team can possibly do down, for the rest of the season.
Yeah. And then if you go move towards the bottom of the East, a couple of two teams that have some injury situations going on with the Bucks. Sounds like Middleton, according to Shams, is going to be out for an indefinite amount of time, which isn't really a surprise to me just because of the fact that when he had the ankle surgeries, right, or surgery on both of his ankles, I just didn't really expect him to be back. I mean, you hope that he would be back sooner rather than later, but the guy unfortunately just has not been able to stay healthy for, any reasonable amount of time in the last couple of seasons. And for the Bucks, they're starting to slip because they've lost 6 in a row. They are playing the Utah Jazz, so they should be able to pick up a win there. They made an adjustment by starting Andre Jackson Jr. in place of Gary Trent just because he's Gary Trent Jr., excuse me, because he's just been really awful. So, and I think with Jackson, you just get more athleticism, you get more defense, and regardless, you should be able to beat Utah because Utah has been horrible. Markkanen is coming back, I think, from a back injury, but he's a back injury is pretty, serious. So my guess is that they'll probably be able to beat them, but they kind of have to hurry up soon and go on some type of run because 1-6, presumably 2-6, assuming they take care of the business with the Jazz. I mean, again, it's still early in the season, and there's a lot of teams whose records aren't particularly that great. So you do have a little bit of leeway there. It's just this kind of has to be fixed soon just because of the fact that this team is supposed to be, one of the better teams in the Eastern Conference as a contender. And, obviously, yeah, Middleton's been out, but Giannis and Lillard have been healthy, and they've been, well, Giannis missed a game or so, but prior to that, prior to Giannis missing time, like, they were still losing games, even with both of those guys playing great. So, they're going to have to kind of get some of this under control, and we'll see what the Andre Jackson Jr., shift does to that, because that is something that should help them with their defense in the backcourt for sure. And, again, he was a college player that was on a title team with UConn, right? So, I mean, presumably, he should help. It's just interesting because for the Bucks, a lot of the guys that they've drafted in the last few years really haven't helped them at all, right? Like, I mean, I can't think of a single guy they've drafted in the last few seasons that's really been an impact player other than potentially Andre Jackson Jr. He's pretty much the only one. So,
Yeah.
that's kind of, the hope, I guess, that you're kind of pinning on this guy. But for Trent, it's rough because that's the guy that, came to the Bucks for a minimum contract. I'm sure under the impression that he was going to start, but he's been terrible. So,
Yeah, it's been a rocky road for the Milwaukee Bucks, but like we said in the intro and like we said in other videos, I mean, look at the way the roster is constructed. It's not really constructed ideally with two superstars in mind. And I will say this, like there are times when the two of them, Dame and Giannis, don't look, the best together. I think individually
right.
they look very good, but I think they're still struggling with that. Whose team is it? That kind of thing. But regardless, I don't think that's the main problem. The main problem is the personnel surrounding them, like we talked about last episode. They're going to need some type of Dallas from last year deadline swap or something like that. They need to bring in some high quality 3-and-D players, defensive minded guys to fill in the holes around Dame and Giannis. And it's really Dame, like, because he's not a good defender, and that's to pair a bad defender with another subpar defender is just a recipe for disaster. I feel like, especially in the backcourt, considering who's in the NBA right now and all these stars and positionless basketball and stuff like that. They're just going to take advantage of mismatches, and the stars are going to eat, and that's kind of what's happening. Even like not bums, but players that you wouldn't really think would be dropping 30 points or dropping 30 points on the Bucks. So,
yeah,
it's been rough for them. And 1-6, I know, like you said, small sample size, but that's a tough hole to climb out of. I don't think people realize that, being 1-6 at the beginning of a season can be very demoralizing. It can, change the way that people look at the season going forward.
Yeah, I mean, my team a couple seasons ago started off 2-10. So,
Sure.
at one point they did make it to the conference finals, but again, the Bucks' goal going into this season was winning the title, right? The Lakers' goal going into that season, I mean, I'm sure they would have liked to, but they knew that going into the season with that initial roster, they didn't have a shot.
Yeah.
This Bucks team was supposed to have a shot. Although they have had some injuries to some guys, but still, like it needs to be better, and hopefully it does get better, because if it doesn't, then you got a real problem on your hands, because I don't really know what you do after that.
Agreed.
Another team in the Eastern Conference, right, that was looked at as a contender but has been off to a rough start is also the Philadelphia 76ers, who are also 1-6.
Mm-hmm.
And they were dealt just a complete series of successive blows, unfortunately. So obviously we know Paul George just recently came back. He's been back for the last couple of games, and obviously he's been working his way back into playing shape because he had been out since the preseason. And then Embiid on his way to return to come back, right? Obviously we know, because we talked about that previous story, right? He got into it with the reporter who said some pretty rough stuff that was very unnecessary. We talked about that in the previous episode, so you can check out that. But we talked about it where he was probably going to be reprimanded for that, and now he's been hit, according to Shams, with a 3-game suspension. So obviously with Embiid, you're going to have to wait a little bit longer to see his debut, right? So it'll be probably sometime, I think it's next week, right? Next Friday or so, if I'm not mistaken. And then to add insult to injury, right? Unfortunately, Tyrese Maxey against the Phoenix Suns hurt his hamstring and didn't come back into the game. And now, according to Shams, he's going to be out for at least a couple of weeks. So that's really tough, because then that changes it from, all right, Paul George is back. by the time he's, physically doing pretty solid, right? Embiid comes back and with Maxey, and then you have all three of them together. But nope, now you have to wait another week. And that's really tough because, and it's actually, a week plus because Maxey's going to be out for 2 weeks at least. So that's rough that we're more than likely going to be, 2 months into the season and we won't have seen, the Sixers big three play a single game together, right? Other than, I guess, not even preseason. Yeah. So we haven't seen them play a single game together. And it'll have been basically a month into the season. And that's pretty tough because of the fact that once you start looking at the next couple of weeks, right? What is their record going to be, right? Because, I mean, obviously, like, their schedule isn't terrible necessarily, but they do have some matchups, during the stretch, against, okay teams, right? I mean, like, yeah, they do play Charlotte, but they play the Lakers, they play the Knicks, they play the Cavs, they play the Magic, and they play the Heat. So, we'll see where Maxey is at, but he could be out longer potentially. And that's the guy that we talked about where if him taking a step forward would kind of raise Philly's ceiling from really, really good team to possibly like championship level team. Because we know like Embiid can be a championship level piece. It's just the fact that you also need the additional help on the perimeter and on the wing, and you have all three, but we're not going to see it. So that's a pretty tough injury, for one of Philadelphia's most important players.
Yeah, if they were fully healthy, it wouldn't have surprised me if they were 6-1. Something like that. I think they would have a really good record because you look at the teams that they lost to. I don't think they lose to Milwaukee. I don't think they lose to Toronto. I think they beat Indiana if they're fully healthy. I think they beat Detroit. I think they beat Memphis. I think they probably would lose to Phoenix, but they definitely beat the Clippers. So, rough start for them. And like you said, it's all injury based. And that kind of goes back to why, like, yes, Paul George is a great signing, but that's kind of why I wasn't too high on them winning the championship because I just don't foresee all of these guys being able to play together. And the one that surprised me the most is obviously Maxey because, he's never really had to deal with like super duper weird, like lingering injuries. And I hope that's not what this is, but, still surprising and definitely hurts when Paul George just came back. Embiid is going to be out for a little bit longer and you kind of just needed Maxey to hold on. And I thought he was doing an okay job of kind of, trying to keep the ship afloat. But, there's only so much you can do.
Right. Yeah, because that's the tough part is that like, yeah, his efficiency is taking a hit, but that's understandable just because he was really the only realistic offensive option you had
Yeah.
for the season so far, right?
Right.
Because Paul George was out, as was Embiid. So there's no real issues with that. It's just rough because that's the guy that I feel like you look at him and that's the guy that can kind of raise Philly's ceiling from, whatever their floor is, obviously, right? Like
Yes.
but it's just the problem is that like you said, because of the durability factor, their floor is kind of low because there is a world where Paul George and Embiid miss a decent amount of time. And then if they miss a decent amount of time, it's very unlikely that they could win, enough games to be, a top seed.
Right.
And that's kind of what you have to do in order to be able to win the championship. You might be able to do that and make a playoff run, but we've already seen in order to win a title, you have to be more than likely a top 3 seed just because of how competitive these conferences are and just the advantage you have of being a top 3 seed. You get home court. For most of the postseason, unless you play, the 1 or 2 seed, there's just a lot of advantages, right? So for Philly, that's like you said, that's why it's hard to pick them to come out of the East just because of the fact that you can never trust their health. Like obviously, like for the Celtics, like yeah, you can't trust Porzingis health wise, but you can trust Tatum, right? I mean, like Brown is hurt this season, but even so, he's not been like completely injury prone the last few years. He's been relatively speaking durable. So with Boston, their 2 best players are generally healthy. So, I mean, and that's kind of a problem with some of these teams. It's just that if they're and for any team, if your stars are hurt, you're not going to win, realistically speaking,
Yep.
unless you have a ton of depth. But even then, you need your stars to play most of the season if you want to be able to have a really good record. And, with Philly, again, like you said with Milwaukee, it's a lot of ground to make up if you're going to start the season off, the way they've started off, which again isn't their fault because, even unlike the Bucks, like their best player hasn't played at all. So I mean that's a major problem, but just either way, you know, I don't know, because like another couple of weeks, and if they kind of stay towards this bottom spot, it's going to start to get really difficult. I imagine that they'll catch up just because, again, outside of Boston and Cleveland, everyone else is basically 500 or worse. So you're
Yeah.
probably not going to be able to catch up to Boston or Cleveland unless one of those teams just starts to have like a ridiculous slide. But you know, I don't know. It's just the injuries suck, and unfortunately, there's been a decent amount of them as of late. Like they're starting to pile up for a number of players.
Yeah, and it's been some like, stars and also, the impact role players, and I think it's hitting everybody kind of across the,
Hmm.
the the league like you said.
Yeah. Because even if you go out west, right? I mean, like you look at the Grizzlies, like Ja got hurt against LA, right? And so, he's already going to miss the next game he's playing in with a hip injury, right? He took a hard fall after not being able to catch a lob, right? It sounds like Anthony Davis is dealing with plantar fasciitis, right? So that's a major problem, for
Hmm.
both of those teams because those are essentially your best players,
Hmm.
right? And, especially for LA, you don't have a very deep team. Memphis has a lot of depth, but you still would like Ja to be available because in the last few years they haven't really been able to win a lot of games when he's been out.
Yep.
So and Memphis has other injuries as well, right? Because Desmond Bane's been hurt, Marcus Smart's been hurt again. So
Yep.
I mean, obviously for the Clippers, right? Kawhi's hurt. So I mean, is there a team that is like that has been kind of healthy? I mean, I guess there's been some, but
Cleveland.
like Phoenix, huh?
Cleveland.
Yeah, like yeah, I guess Phoenix. I mean, Beal's been hurt, but like Booker and Durant have been there. Those are the two main guys that you need in order to win those games, right? So, I mean, New Orleans is on another team, right? That team has had like just an atrocious stretch of injuries where we already talked about it. No CJ McCollum, no DeJounte Murray. Zion Williamson missed, I think, a game or two because of an injury. And then Jordan Hawkins, who was a guy that was coming in because people were hurt, he got hurt too. Daniel Tice also hurt. So, it's just, again, injuries can always dictate how a team's season will go. But for some of these teams, they've just snake bit. Like New Orleans is just snake bit. Because, I mean, it feels like every year there's always some stretch or like some point in the season where they just get decimated with injuries. And it always comes at like the worst possible time where it feels like just when you're starting to feel better about them, then everything just gets taken away. And I forgot Trey Murphy too.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you're talking about half the rotation.
Yeah, it's rough, and these things are gonna pile up. And the unfortunate part about injuries is sometimes when this stuff happens early in the season, it doesn't get better. It just gets it
Right.
just gets worse.
Yeah. Sometimes it piles up.
Yeah.
Um, another game the other night, just to kind of mention, you had the Hawks and the Knicks, right? Kind of an old school rematch, right, between two quote unquote rivals, right? Because obviously Trey Young, and the Knicks have a little bit of history,
Yep.
and the man of the game was Zachary Reese-Share, who basically finished with 33 points, and kind of in what was probably the best game of the season by a rookie so far this year. I mean,
100%.
because because the rookie class by and large, in terms of their numbers, has been pretty weak, and some of that is because a lot of these guys just don't really play a whole lot of minutes,
Yeah.
right? But with the injury to DeAndre Hunter, Risa Share's been in the starting lineup, and I mean, you talk about the numbers he had: 33 points, 7 rebounds, 3 steals, 2 blocks, 6 of 10 from three. And kind of playing great defense as well. Where we talked about it, like, yeah, offensively early in the season he was kind of struggling, but you could tell that he's clearly a legit player. And I definitely made the mistake of not having him mocked at number one. But so far, what have you seen from him in terms of just kind of the overall play? Because this was obviously his best game so far as a pro.
Yeah, I mean, he's kind of living up to, or he lived up to, um, his scouting report pretty much, coming out of the Euros and stuff like that. So I would say, off ball defense, very, very good. That has been the number one thing that has surprised me the most, where it's like he's very engaged off the ball defensively and being able to get into lanes using his length. I think that's awesome. And that's kind of like the prototypical 3-and-D kind of tenacity that you would want. And now the 3-point shot is falling because before getting great open looks, like generating open looks. They just weren't falling. So hopefully he can find a rhythm. I'm not saying he's going to put up 33 every night, but if he could shoot, around that 35%, 40% mark from three and continue to do the great things that he does off the ball defensively, that would be awesome. And I like the fact that, he chased after boards. He wasn't just, scoring. He kind of had like a all around game, on both ends of the floor. So shout out to him for that one. I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the cool part is that, we talked about it where he's a guy that in theory, right, is one of the more ready prospects for a team just because like you said he's, on paper, he's a 3-and-D wing. And that's something that the Hawks, they have wings, but like, outside of Jalen Johnson, none of them are that. I mean, Hunter's decent, but you know what I mean? Like, long term, Risa Share might be a better option just because of the fact that, just there, I think there's a little bit more potential there. Whereas with
Agreed.
Hunter, we kind of already know who he is at this point, and he's also been injury prone at this point, unfortunately too. And we talked about it with the Hawks, where when they were healthy at the beginning of the season, they looked pretty good, on both ends of the floor, right? Because you replace guys like Dejounte Murray with Dyson Daniels defensively. That's a completely different type of player, right?
Yeah.
Where yeah, he's not necessarily a quote unquote scorer, but he was shooting well to begin the season, and obviously he's been awesome defensively. So that's a great look for the Hawks. As they continue to do whatever they're going to do at this point, because they have some decisions presumably to make with some of the players on this roster as to whether or not they're going to keep them long term or not. But good, great game for Risa Share. And then on the other end of the ticket, the New York Knicks. Right now they've dropped to 3-5. They've lost a couple of games. Towns had 34 and 16. But it just hasn't been enough, right? And what's going on with this team, you think? Because, this was your team or picked to win the title, but, obviously it's still early. And we know like part of it is like, yeah, like they're missing a guy like Mitchell Robinson, right? Who's better than either backup big that they have, right? Like better than Jericho Sims, better than Ariel Huck Porter, who they just signed to a new contract. But, is there anything else you're seeing that's concerning you, or are you just kind of chalking it up to, let's wait to see what happens when Robinson comes back?
Oh boy. I'm scared, scared, scared.
Hmm.
This is not looking too good for them. I think, it's I think it's a chemistry thing. It's also obviously, you talked about it, the guys being out for sure, but number one, it's a chemistry thing. Jalen Brunson's looked, I'm not gonna say bad, but not as good as I thought. But I think he might be having a slow start, and that might be due to the fact that bringing in a guy like Towns is a big shakeup. It's a big difference from what they had last year and the years before. So that's one thing. I think OG Anunoby's been okay. I just feel like everything around Brunson has been somewhat underwhelming, which probably leads to his performances being a little underwhelming. So, like I said, I think I'm gonna chalk it up to chemistry. I think they're off to a slow start, but yeah, it needs to pick up soon because that was my pick to win the finals. But right now, it's not looking too hot. I hope they look better. Mid-season. I don't think there's much that they can do to change it outside of fight through the growing pains and figure this stuff out.
Yeah, I think they will look better eventually. I just think part of it is they're probably going to also need to probably make some type of move to add somebody to the second unit because that's probably something that you're kind of missing. I mean, again, like Robinson will help with rebounding and defense. That might give you the opportunity to, hey, let's do a two big lineup with Towns and Robinson out there. And
Sure.
that will give them some extra different types of looks, right? Because, they are kind of small, outside of Towns. And that's probably an issue too. But I just feel like rotationally, they may just need to have another additional piece at the deadline because with Robinson, it's just hard to trust him because he hasn't been healthy. So
Agreed.
that's something where we're still not going to see him until January at the earliest. So I anticipate that by the trade deadline, they'll probably try to do something. But like you said, for now, there's nothing you can really do. So they're just going to have to, like you said, play through a lot of the mistakes. Guys are going to have to probably just be more consistent and, you just kind of go from there. But,
Yeah.
Again, it's not panic time yet, obviously. But, because again, other than Boston and Cleveland, everyone in the East has been pretty underwhelming. So that's kind of the benefit of not having a completely horrible record. But it does need to get better for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah, I think this is a team that we kind of have to watch out for and play the long game with. But as of right now, 3-4 is not the ideal start for this squad.
Yeah. Then you have the Miami Heat against the Phoenix Suns, right? Losing, basically in a very close game, right? That was where there's been a pattern with the Heat where they've been pretty solid in the first halves of the games, but then in the second halves, it just kind of feels like they run out of gas, run out of steam. And this was a problem last season too, where all of a sudden in the third quarters, they would just look like a completely different team. And, again, the roster is a little bit different than it was, before the deadline last year, right? Because obviously, like Rozier's here, who didn't really play much. The rest of the key guys have mainly been healthy by and large, but it still hasn't really translated too much, to win. So, what's going on with the Heat in terms of these second halves?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not. I can't lie to you. I haven't really been watching a lot of Miami Heat basketball. I just know
Mhm.
they haven't looked the part. Um, it might be end of an era. I'm not sure. Like Jimmy Butler looks looks like age is kind of catching up to him a little bit. Bam has looked underwhelming. I will say Tyler Hero, on the other hand, has
Mhm.
looked pretty solid through what I've seen.
Yeah,
Which is the surprise. I didn't think he would be the guy to look the best on the squad offensively, but I don't know. They just can't close games. I don't know what's going on. I don't think it's a coaching thing. I think it kind of goes back to personnel. I think they have
yeah,
solid guys, but I just don't think they're deep enough to really sustain fourth quarter leads. But it's tough when you're playing against Phoenix, and when they're on a heater like that. Like KD
yeah.
scores 32. That's kind of something that's hard to overcome because,
2020 from Nurkic.
yeah, that came out of nowhere too. D Book looking pretty good as well. So that's a tough team to beat, and that's where I think
Yeah.
it kind of goes back to the conversation of the West being much better than the East. Because that's the kind of competition that you're going up against every night in the Western Conference.
Right, because you look at the Suns, and like you said, they've been playing very well, right? Because
Yeah,
they're right there with Golden State at 7-1.
yeah,
Beal's been in and out of the lineup, but they have been healthier so far than they were last year, which is a bonus because they've been able to play more games together, and they just look better, right? They have more depth. They have a lot more additional pieces, right? A guy like a Grayson Allen who was starting, now he's coming off the bench, right? Royce O'Neal's coming off the bench. Obviously, you have Ryan Dunn, who's not going to play as much as he was before, just because of the pieces that have come back. So they look significantly better, than they did. I mean, last year, like they were winning games, but it does look more legit this year so far. And Bud has also done a pretty good job with the rotation as well, and they're taking and making way more threes, which is also helpful too, because it just makes their offense just a lot more potent, which is
yeah.
what you want because they are an offense first team anyways, and so it would make sense that their offense should be the best part of the team, and it's looked the part so far.
Yeah, it doesn't look as forced, especially like the Beal component. Seems like KD
Mhm.
Book 1-2 punch. Bradley Beal there to pick up the leftover pieces, whatever that may be, alongside Tyus Jones. So overall, I no complaints from a Durant fan over here.
Yeah. And then I guess you going back to the West, right? You do have a couple of teams, right? Like say the Rockets, they've picked up a little bit more steam, right? So now they've won a couple games in a row to get back above 500. Um but this last team I think is kind of an interesting story, right? So you had the Lakers and the Grizzlies play, right? And obviously AD we kind of mentioned already, right? He was out, right? Because of the plantar fasciitis foot thing, unfortunately, right? So he doesn't play. Um and they've now gone 1-4 or yeah, 1-4 on the road trip. And it's kind of a lot more of the same issues that we talked about going into the season where you just don't really have, enough depth behind Anthony Davis. But more importantly, the depth that we thought that they were going to have anyways hasn't really been there at all because these guys just haven't been good. When you look at, who's been playing for them, you really only look at about four guys that have been from solid to, good, right? Like if solid or better, right? You'd say LeBron, AD obviously has been awesome. He's been their best player. Austin hasn't been as good in the last couple of games, but by and large, he has been good. And then Rui. right? Who did struggle in the last couple of games he played, but he's still been a positive. But after that, pretty much nobody else really has played well at all. Like D'Angelo Russell's been awful. He was benched in this Grizzlies game, and Redick basically just kind of called him out and essentially said he wasn't competing, or paying attention to detail. So kind of back to getting benched like last year, essentially. Um, and again, the other key pieces that we were kind of talking about if these things panned out, and that's kind of why we talked about the variance of this team. Gabe Vincent's been awful, as is Max Christie. And that's kind of something that, I think we expected Vincent to be better. I think we didn't really know what we were going to get from Max Christie just because of the fact that he's not really been, a consistent piece of the rotation, but you hoped he'd be better just because of his age. But Vincent was the one that, because he's already been in the league for a while and now he's supposed to be healthy, you would have assumed he would have been better, but you'd be wrong. Yeah, he's been, pretty abysmal. Honestly, on both, like the bench also just in general has been really bad, which we've talked about anyways. Going into the season, we didn't expect much from the second unit because it's not a lot of guys, but it's been even worse on both ends of the floor because the offense from a lot of these guys has been really abysmal to such a degree where unless you're playing lockdown defense, like it's going to affect your defense anyways, because when you can't score, I mean, it's really a problem because they're one of the worst teams in the league on defense. I think as of this recording, they're ranked 28th defensively, right? Only the Pelicans and the Raptors are worse than them. And that's a major problem because that means even with AD, they haven't really been good on defense. And, we've talked about that where it looks like some of the more athletic teams they're going to struggle with. And, again, this is kind of why we talked about going into the season, not a contender, and you would have to make, some moves in order to get there. Like the best version of this team can be good enough to win X amount of games, right? Like probably a similar amount of games to last year. But so far, if you're kind of scratching off a checklist, there's a few pieces that haven't been checked, right? Because, we talked about it. LeBron and AD have to be healthy. AD just got hurt, so we'll see if we have to, scratch that off the list. But he's only missed a game so far. So that's kind of a check, I guess. But then you go after that, D'Lo playing as well as he did last season, can't check that. And then obviously Max Christie and Gabe Vincent being parts of their team when they weren't really last year, can't check that. And then no backup center, can't check that. Like it's gotten to the point now where Cam Reddish is now back to playing regular minutes over Max Christie because he's been terrible. So just kind of a interesting situation where, again, Redick is clearly getting frustrated with D'Angelo Russell, and, it's just, this is something we talked about where it was kind of surprising that they hadn't moved him after this long because, at a certain point, he's probably going to start, I don't know if checking out is the right word, but we've talked about it. We're at a certain point, you kind of have to decide, like, what are you going to do with that group? Because we know the backcourt defensively isn't really good enough, and offensively, it's not elite enough to make up for it. So, but you can't do anything right now because you're not going to make any moves now.
Yeah, I mean, with the Lakers, I think it's a couple problems, like you said. I'm not gonna pile on D'Lo. I don't think it's all him. In the starting lineup, and
At
I know
all,
you're,
'cause I mentioned
yeah,
other guys too. They've been
yeah,
even worse.
yeah, I know, but that's my guy. I'm a day one D'Lo defender, and I'll stand on that. I think he's been, okay. I'm not gonna say horrible, but okay. Offensively, defensively, non-existent. What's new? But the bench is the real problem for me. The depth, like when I look at the box scores for these games, Cam Reddish, Christian Coloco, Gabe Vincent, Max Christie, Bronny James. That's bad. That's like Denver level bad, in my opinion. I really don't know how they kind of were able to get away with kind of fooling us a little bit through like the first three games where it's like you felt a little special about the team. I will say the vibes are different, but I think when it comes to the execution and the personnel, they're lacking in both, and that's the problem. I think the system itself is awesome. They're generating good looks, but there's a lot of guys that just either A, aren't ready, will never be ready, or I don't know. I don't know what's going on, but they need to do something, figure out something. But like you said, there's not a lot that they can do, considering the
Right.
personnel. So
Yeah, because again, like you said, the bench, like you said, there's not a lot of NBA level, guys
No,
that are playing, and some of those guys we thought would be, NBA level guys, because
sure.
that's the thing, right? Like we already knew that the depth was not great, but you thought that there were at least a couple of guys, that if they were panning out, it would be better. But, I guess the question is, the two main culprits, Gabe Vincent and Max Christie, what's happened to those two guys? Because, again, with Christie, he didn't play consistently a lot the first 2 years, anyways, but in the opportunities he got, he looked relatively solid, for what you would have expected of him. And then Gabe Vincent, obviously, we saw for the Miami Heat, but, what's happened to those guys? Because those guys pretty much at this point have been, unplayable. I mean, because again, like Vincent will try on defense, but you're just getting nothing out of him on the other end.
Yeah,
And then
Max
for Christie,
Christie. Yeah,
bad on offense.
he's just not shooting well at all, and career high in minutes. Through this season so far, averaging 16. So you can't say that he's not getting enough minutes or give him more. No, I think I think what he's getting
Right.
is about as much as you can really give him. Like that's a lot of opportunities. Like even in this Memphis game, 19 minutes, almost 20. Yeah,
Yeah.
not a lot of stuff. And with Gabe Vincent,
And he got benched.
yeah, and with Gabe Vincent, he's just fallen off the map. I don't know what happened to him. I know he was like kind of like a hero for Miami, but my God, I don't know what happened with him. Like it feels like he's regressed to the point where he's just doing cardio and pretty much passing.
Yeah.
That's about it. Like he doesn't give you anything on the offensive end in terms of scoring output. Definitely doesn't give you anything defensively. If anything, he's somewhat of a turnover machine and a cone on defense. If you want me to be honest, like a liability. It's quite frustrating to kind of look at. So I can understand why Laker fans are freaking pissed with this god awful bench. But you know, this is the roster that they went into the season with, and everybody had questions about it. Everybody gave it a
Right.
bad grade, and we're seeing why. They had a nice little hot start, but they've come back down to earth. Granted, I think they could have won some of these games if AD wasn't hurt. Like if AD wasn't hurt, they could have pulled out a W against Memphis because I think he had been playing out of his mind. That's a big thing. But
Right.
regardless, it can't just be LeBron and AD out there. With
Yeah.
Austin
And
Reeve
that's
games like sprinkled in here and there. It's not a recipe for success in my opinion.
and that's the thing that you have to hope for anyways, because like if AD has to miss any decent level of time, then that's pretty much a curtain because of the
Yeah.
fact that, again, as we talked about, they didn't address, the big situation at all, right? Because, it's Jackson Hayes and Christian Coloco as your backup centers, which again is not necessarily a situation that you really want to put yourself in. Because
Mhm.
even if Christian Wood were healthy, like it's still not an ideal backup big rotation necessarily. And again, like you said, it's the roster that they went into the season with, which is why, like you said, both of us gave them a not so great grade, with the caveat of the best version of this team could, in theory, be good enough to win a similar amount of games to last year. But again, as of right now, there are pieces on that checklist that so far have not been crossed or checked out or checked off yet. And if they don't get checked off, then you're not going to be able to get to that win total from last year. It's going to be less.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So, again, a lot going on around the league, and a lot more to come. But we're gonna be referring to a few things that have also happened recently. So, in terms of news and rumors, so obviously, as we already talked about, according to Brian Windhorst, right, the Warriors are a candidate to make a big trade to build around Stephen Curry, right? He basically said this is a team that's got an itchy trigger finger trying to make a big deal. So, I guess the question would be, if we're talking about, it doesn't have to be a specific player, but if you're the Warriors, what type of player are you looking for, to put you over the top, right? And what players would you probably consider putting into that deal?
Um, that's a tough question because I mean,
Mhm.
in my opinion, I think it has to be a star. Like I said, I just don't think a team full of solid role players and just Steph can get you over the hump to the point where it's like, yeah, this is a legit contender. It's a regular season team, so I think you need to compile a lot of those guys who are playing out of their minds to get a guy who's going to play out of their mind every single night, just like Steph, and bring that offensive output, and maybe it's like a guy like a two-way guy. I don't know who's out there. That's the problem, considering the CBA, all the rules and stuff like that. How's the money gonna work? But yeah, I mean, with Windhorst saying all this stuff, that makes me kind of think that this could potentially happen. Markkinen's kind of out the window, so
Yeah.
I don't know. I really don't know who could kind of emerge, and I know sometimes like those candidates don't really appear until we get closer to the deadline. I know there's been a lot of talk about Jimmy Butler. Not a fan of that at all. Giannis, I don't think that's super duper likely because what kind of package are we talking? But I mean, those are the only two names that I've seen and heard being floated around, and I guess that's kind of rightfully so since it's so early in the season. But I think give it like a month, I would say, and we'll probably start, hearing of some sort of star that's disgruntled and somebody's going to give up a package for him.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's probably just some type of player with some level of size and athleticism and shot creating ability. I think is probably just somebody that can create their own offense because so that way Steph doesn't have to be, your only, like you said, primary shot creator on the team.
Yes,
If you can get another guy that can do that, and like you said, can also play on the other end of the ball, i.e., defense, I think that's probably the type of player you're looking for. But like you said, some of those type of players we will not know if they're available until, like you said, we get closer to the deadline. So that's kind of key there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then moving on, kind of a really unfortunate scenario. So according to Sham, so Greg Popovich, he's been out the last couple of games, and he's saying that the Spurs have quote a great level of concern after Saturday's situation that required medical attention. So we don't really know what's going on, but so far they've had one of their assistant coaches, Mitch Johnson, be the interim head coach. So right now he's dealing with a health issue. And again, we don't know what it is because it hasn't been disclosed. But obviously that's that's obviously something that you don't want to hear as of right now, just because of the fact that it sounds like it could potentially be very serious. And obviously he's 75, so whatever is going on, hopefully it's something that will allow him to return as soon as he can.
Yeah, I mean, prayers on it for sure. And, I think, like you talked about, Mitch Johnson said, he's in good spirits and he will be back. So that's kind of encouraging, but that's one of the worst things possible that could have probably happened to San Antonio this season, it's just going to stunt everybody's growth. And I know, it's tough to talk about, but it's rough because I mean, what can you really do? And he's irreplaceable in my opinion, to that team and to that franchise, and what he's done for them as well. So really, really rough.
Yeah, and then after that, Bulls expected to shop stars. Chicago to put Levine, Vucevic on block at some point this season. I mean, we've been kind of hearing the same version of this for a while. I mean, I guess their contracts are getting quote unquote closer to ending. So maybe that's the type of player that Golden State will be chasing after. I mean, doubt it, but what value do you think that they have to some of these teams? Because I mean, it's like what we've talked about, where Levine's a good player, but the problem is the contract, and what team is going to be willing to give up essentially 40 million, or whatever it is worth of players to get him? Because I mean, like at one point we talked about LA. Well, you're gonna have to come up with a package of X amount of players to put together. Now, maybe again, considering how some of these players have played, maybe you don't mind parting ways with some of them. But just in general, I feel like the Vucevic contract is probably the one that's, well, not probably, I think it is the one that's definitely more tradable. But then the question still remains, okay, what team would be interested in Vucevic? Is that like a New Orleans Pelicans deal, right, where they don't have, a guy that you would feel great about at the 5, but I think you would like somebody better on defense. Maybe you just kind of talk yourself into the wings, but just in general, of these two guys, what teams do you think should be interested in either of these players?
Like you said, I think the Pelicans should be interested in Vucevic. I think any team without a center should really be focused on him. Levine is the trickier one because I think, you already talked about it. The contract is a little bit too much. I don't think anybody's really going to bite on that. I don't think he gets moved, but I could see Vucevic being moved because I think he has rehabbed a little bit of his value, actually being a stretch five, throughout the season. So that's looked good. He can actually still space the floor. It's just obviously we know not a great defender, but, he's still solid offensively.
Yeah, so we'll see where this goes because again, as the season goes on, a lot of these things will kind of start to work themselves out and start to shape up. And we could be due for a shocker move by the time the deadline comes around. But
Yeah.
obviously, that's it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, let us know your thoughts on all these team situations, right? Which teams have impressed you, right? Obviously, talk about the injuries if you want. And just again, always appreciate people for leaving comments on our videos or our shorts because, we like interacting with, everybody who wants to kind of give their thoughts on our content overall, right? So obviously, as we've talked about, we appreciate all the support. Don't forget to like and subscribe. If you leave a comment, we'll read it at the beginning of the video. We'll see you in the next episode.